"Don't come home tonight, Mrs. Ashford." Rosa's voice was shaking, which was the first thing that told me something was wrong, because in 19 years of working in our house, I had never once heard Rosa's voice shake over anything. I was sitting in the back of a taxi, 3 minutes from my own driveway, my overnight bag still packed for a business trip. I'd told Michael I was taking that morning, though I'd actually canceled it 2 days earlier, and told no one, planning to surprise him for our anniversary instead. If I walked through that door in the next 5 minutes, I was about to surprise him with something I clearly wasn't prepared for at all. "Rosa, I'm 2 minutes away. What's going on?" "Please," she said, and I could hear her hands shaking too, somewhere in the background, glass or china rattling faintly against a counter. "Just stay away for 1 hour. I'm begging you." The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, clearly having caught enough of the conversation to sense something was wrong, and slowed the car slightly, without my asking, an unexpected small kindness from a stranger that I found myself grateful for in a way disproportionate to the gesture itself. "Everything all right back there?" he asked, and I told him, honestly, that I wasn't sure yet, and asked if he'd mind pulling over for a few minutes once we got closer. "My name is Vivian Ashford. I was 47 years old, sitting in the back of a taxi on my 19th wedding anniversary, when the one person in my life who had never once told me what to do begged me not to come home. If I had listened to her completely, if I'd simply told the driver to circle the block for an hour the way she asked, I would never have learned that my husband had spent the entire week planning our anniversary dinner for someone else, in our own dining room, using the same china we'd registered for at our wedding. Rosa told me, weeks later, once things had settled enough for either of us to talk about that night calmly, that she'd stood in our kitchen for nearly 10 minutes before finally calling me, weighing 19 years of careful professional boundaries against something that felt, in that moment, larger than any boundary she'd ever respected. "I kept thinking about what my own mother would have wanted someone to do for her," she said. "She never had anyone tell her the truth in time. I didn't want that to be you too." Rosa Delgado came to work for us the year Michael and I bought our first house together, back when Michael was still building his firm from a converted garage. She started as a part-time housekeeper, twice a week, and over 19 years became something closer to family than staff. She'd sat with my own mother through 11 hours of labor. When Elise was born, because Michael had been stuck at a job site 2 states away, she'd nursed me through a bad flu the year. Michael was traveling constantly, bringing me soup every afternoon on her own time, unpaid. She'd never, not once in 19 years, offered an opinion about anything happening inside our marriage. That wasn't strictly her business. A discretion I had always quietly admired, and apparently had come to rely on more than I fully understood, until the one night she finally broke it. Looking back, the year before that taxi ride had been quietly, unmistakably different, in ways I'd allowed myself to explain away one at a time. Michael had been working later, more distracted, occasionally sharp with me, over small things that had never bothered him before. The way I loaded the dishwasher, a scheduling conflict I hadn't caused, small irritations that seemed to arrive from somewhere else entirely, and land on me simply because I happened to be standing nearby. He'd started mentioning Sabrina Cole, the marketing consultant I myself had recommended to his firm 18 months earlier, a talented young woman I'd genuinely liked, and had, more than once, invited to dinner as a friend, rather than simply a professional contact. Michael brought her name up with increasing frequency over the past few months. A smart idea she'd had, a joke she'd made, a late strategy session that had run long. Always professionally, always in a tone that gave me no obvious reason for alarm, and yet somewhere underneath the reasonable explanations, something in me had begun quietly, persistently, refusing to fully relax. I had originally planned to fly home 2 days early, surprise Michael with an anniversary weekend neither of us had properly celebrated in years, and I'd spent the morning of that flight walking through an airport gift shop, trying to decide between two different bottles of the whiskey he liked, eventually buying both, unable to choose, feeling almost giddy with the kind of anticipation I hadn't allowed myself in longer than I wanted to admit. I remember texting Rosa from the gate, asking her to make sure the house looked nice, not realizing, of course, that she'd spend that entire morning setting a table for an anniversary dinner that was never meant to include me at all. Michael and I met when I was 26, both of us young and ambitious in the specific, hungry way people are, before life gives them any real reason to slow down. He was 3 years into a small architecture practice. He'd started with a single employee, and I was working at a mid-sized marketing agency, good enough to be trusted with real accounts. We met at a mutual friend's gallery opening, both of us hovering near the food table rather than the art, and talked for 2 hours about nothing important, the way you do when a conversation is already starting to matter more than either person is ready to admit. Proposed on the roof of the first building his firm ever designed, walking me up there under the pretense of showing me a construction detail. We married the following spring, in a small ceremony in my parents' garden, and for most of our 19 years together, I believed, without ever needing to examine the belief too closely, that we had built something solid. 2 successful careers, a daughter now away at college, a house Michael had personally designed down to the door frames, a marriage that had weathered the ordinary hard years every long marriage weathers. I sat in that taxi, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something in my chest go very still. "Rosa," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could manage, "I need you to tell me exactly what's happening in my house right now." I thought, absurdly, in that same moment, of our 10th anniversary, the one we'd spent at a rented cabin 2 hours outside the city, Michael cooking a spectacularly mediocre steak dinner, over a fire pit he'd insisted on building himself, both of us laughing until nearly midnight over how badly the evening had gone according to plan. I had believed that particular ease between us was permanent. Sitting in that taxi 9 years later, I understood I'd been wrong. There was a dinner, about 4 months before that anniversary, when Michael canceled our regular Friday date night for what he called an urgent client deadline, and I drove past his office on my way home from a late meeting of my own, only to see just 2 cars in the parking lot, his, and one I didn't recognize, a silver sedan I'd later learn belonged to Sabrina. I remember sitting at the red light half a block away, watching the office's second-floor light still on, telling myself deadlines sometimes required exactly this kind of last-minute collaboration, and driving home without stopping to ask a single question. There was another moment, about 6 weeks after that, at a firm holiday party I'd attended every year for nearly 2 decades. When I noticed Michael and Sabrina standing slightly apart from the rest of the room, their conversation quieter, more private than the easy professional chatter surrounding them. I'd walked over, made polite conversation, and watched Sabrina's easy warmth toward me falter, just slightly, in a way I chalked up at the time to simple professional awkwardness around a partner's spouse. I think now that what I actually witnessed was guilt, dressed up carefully enough that I mistook it for something else entirely. Rosa's voice, still shaking on the phone, finally gave shape to everything I'd been refusing to name. "He told me to take the whole evening off," she said. "Which he's never done before. Not once in 19 years, not even for your actual anniversary parties. He had me set the dining room this morning before I left, the good china, the candles, the wine he's been saving. He told me it was a surprise for you." She paused, and I heard her take a shaking breath. "Mrs. Ashford, I came back 20 minutes ago because I forgot my sweater, and Miss Cole's car is in your driveway." "She's inside. She's wearing the necklace I saw him buying at the jeweler's downtown 3 weeks ago, the one he told me was for you." I sat in the taxi, 3 blocks from my own front door, on my 19th wedding anniversary, and understood, with a slow, cold clarity, exactly what kind of surprise my husband had actually planned. I had the driver pull over half a block from the house, telling him I needed a moment, and sat there turning 3 things over in the space of about 10 minutes, each one landing harder than the last. The meter still running, the city outside the window suddenly feeling entirely unfamiliar. Despite being 3 blocks from a house I'd lived in for over a decade, the first thing was simple enough to check myself. I called the airline directly, giving them my confirmation number, and asked, as casually as I could manage, whether anyone else had recently called about my reservation. The agent, after a moment of typing, confirmed that yes, someone matching my husband's information had called that very morning to verify my flight had departed on schedule. Not out of concern, the agent said. Just a standard confirmation call, the kind airlines field constantly from family members checking on travel plans. Michael hadn't simply assumed I'd be gone. He'd verified it methodically, the same way he verified a building's structural calculations before signing off on them. The second thing came from Rosa herself, still on the phone, her voice steadying slightly now that she'd said the hardest part out loud. This isn't the first time I've noticed things, Mrs. Ashford. I didn't want to say anything before because I wasn't sure, and it wasn't my place. But there was a work conference in March, the one in Denver, and I remember him packing a shirt I know, for a fact you'd never seen him wear before, and a bottle of the same wine that's sitting open in your dining room right now. I told myself it was nothing. I've been telling myself that for months, honestly, and I'm ashamed I didn't say something sooner. Her voice caught slightly. I kept thinking, it's not my place, over and over, every single time something felt wrong. I'm sorry it took me this long to stop telling myself that. 3 months. Whatever this was, it hadn't started tonight, and Rosa, in her own quiet way, had apparently been carrying the weight of that suspicion alone for longer than either of us had realized. The third thing I confirmed myself, walking quietly around to the side yard, rather than the front door. Staying low along the hedge. Michael had planted the year we moved in, the same hedge Elise used to hide behind during backyard games of hide-and-seek when she was small. The grass was cold and damp under my heels, my overnight bag still slung awkwardly over one shoulder, and for a strange moment, I felt less like a woman confronting her marriage's collapse and more like a child sneaking back into her own house past curfew. Through the gap in the dining room curtains, I could see the table set exactly as Rosa had described. The good china, the candles, two-place settings instead of the usual four we'd used every anniversary since Elise was born. And Sabrina Cole, laughing at something Michael had just said, wearing a necklace I recognized instantly because I had been standing 3 feet away at the jeweler's counter when he'd told the assistant it was for someone very special. And let me assume, wrongly, exactly who that meant. I stood in my own side yard, on my own anniversary, holding my overnight bag I still hadn't set down, and made a decision I have never once regretted since. I wasn't going to knock. I was going to walk through my own front door. I remember the strange, deliberate slowness of that. Walk back around to the front of the house, every step feeling both entirely ordinary and completely unlike anything I'd ever done before. The same brick path I'd walked thousands of times over 11 years in that house, the same porch light Michael had installed himself the summer we moved in. All of it suddenly foreign, as though I were seeing my own front door for the first time rather than the 11,000th. I walked around to the front, let myself in with my own key, the click of the lock sounding louder than it ever had in 19 years of coming home, and stepped into the dining room just as Michael was raising a glass, mid-toast, Sabrina seated across from him in the chair I had sat in for 19 consecutive anniversaries. To finally starting the life Michael began and stopped completely, the glass frozen halfway to his lips as he registered who was standing in the doorway. Sabrina turned, and I watched every trace of color leave her face in real time, her hand rising instinctively to touch the necklace at her throat, as though she could somehow will it invisible. Vivian. Michael set the glass down so quickly, wine sloshed over the rim, pooling on the tablecloth Rosa had ironed that morning, spreading slowly across the white linen like something that couldn't be undone. Your flight. I confirmed your flight left this morning. You confirmed it, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I know. Rosa told me. I actually canceled the trip 2 days ago, Michael. I was going to surprise you for our anniversary. The room went completely silent, the only sound, the faint drip of spilled wine off the edge of the table onto the floor. Michael had personally designed 19 years earlier, back when a life together was still something we were building, rather than something one of us was apparently already trying to leave. The candles Rosa had lit that morning burned steadily on, indifferent to everything unfolding beneath them. I can explain, Michael said, the particular hollow phrase of a man who has clearly never once had to say it before and doesn't actually know what comes next. I'd like to hear you try, I said, pulling out the fourth chair, the one that had sat empty for this dinner, and sitting down calmly across from both of them, setting my overnight bag beside my feet with a deliberate, unhurried motion. I hoped conveyed exactly the composure I was fighting to actually feel. Rosa, would you mind staying? I think you've already seen enough of this evening that you should probably see how it ends. Rosa, who had come back inside quietly behind me, nodded from the doorway, her expression somewhere between apology and fierce, protective loyalty, and took a step further into the room rather than retreating to the kitchen the way 19 years of professional habit might have suggested she should. Sabrina found her voice first, shakier than I expected, from a woman I'd always known as confident, almost aggressively competent in every meeting I'd ever watched her run. Vivian, I never meant. You've worked with my husband for 18 months, I said, cutting her off gently but firmly. I recommended you for that position myself. I had you to dinner at this table, more than once. I don't need you to tell me what you meant. I think the necklace and the reserved flight confirmation already told me everything I need to know. Michael tried once more, his hands spread flat on the table as though bracing himself. It's not what it looks like, we were just. Michael, I said, you verified my flight left this morning specifically so you could set this table for two. There isn't a version of tonight where that sentence ends anywhere good. I let the silence stretch a moment before continuing, my voice quieter now but no less steady. 19 years, and the version of tonight I actually planned was flying home early to surprise you. I keep wondering which one of us was more naive. Sabrina reached for her purse, hands unsteady, clearly calculating the fastest path to the door. I think I should go. I think that's the first accurate thing anyone said at this table tonight, I told her, without malice, simply stating a fact. She stood, gathered her coat from the back of the chair. My chair, I noted with a strange, distant clarity, and paused at the doorway for one final moment. For what it's worth, she said, not quite looking at me, I didn't know how long this had actually been going on. He told me things that weren't true either. I believed her, mostly, though it changed very little about the rest of the evening. Michael sat very still after she left, staring at the tablecloth stain, spreading slowly beneath the tipped wineglass, and finally looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him in over 2 decades. Something close to genuine fear. What happens now? He asked quietly. I honestly don't know yet, I said. But I know it starts with you sleeping somewhere else tonight. Sabrina left within the hour, walking out past me without another word, her heels loud against the hardwood in a house that had gone entirely, permanently quiet. Michael and I sat at that table until nearly midnight, the candles burning down to nothing, the conversation moving through every stage of a marriage ending in real time, his halting, incomplete explanations, my questions, long silences neither of us seemed able to fill. Rosa quietly cleared the untouched second course, sometime around 10, and I remember catching her eye across the room, a small wordless exchange of gratitude that didn't require either of us to say anything more. I called Elise the following morning, dreading the conversation more than almost anything else in the days ahead. She was 20 years old, midway through her sophomore year, and I'd spent the entire drive to campus the following weekend rehearsing gentler ways to say what had happened, none of which felt adequate. Once I actually sat across from her in a campus coffee shop. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished, staring down at her cup, and then said, with a bluntness that startled me, I always thought something felt off about him this past year. I didn't want to say anything, because I figured it was just me being paranoid, being away at school and missing normal stuff at home. She reached across the table and took my hand. I'm glad Rosa called you. I'm glad you didn't just walk in there blind. Are you angry with him? I asked, unsure I actually wanted the answer. Elise considered the question seriously, the way she'd always considered hard questions even as a child. I think I will be, eventually, she said. Right now, I mostly just feel sad for the version of this May family I thought we had. But I'm not angry at you for anything if that's what you're worried about. None of this is yours to carry. I hadn't expected, in the middle of the worst week of my adult life, to feel comforted by my own daughter, but I did entirely. Sitting in a coffee shop 3 states from the house I no longer knew how to think of as home, I called a family law attorney the following week. a steady, unflappable woman named Diane Forsyth, who listened to the entire story without interrupting once. The same quality I'd come to appreciate in Rosa over 19 years, apparently a trait I gravitated toward in the people I needed to trust most during a crisis. Her office was small and unpretentious, a stack of case files on every available surface, and she took notes in careful, economical handwriting while I recounted the entire evening, start to finish, my voice only wavering once, on the detail about the necklace. The firm's policy violation is going to matter more than you might expect, Diane told me, reviewing the notes I'd brought. Not for the divorce itself necessarily, but for how his partners respond once this becomes impossible to keep quiet, which, given how many people were in that dining room, it will. She looked up from her legal pad. I have to ask, because it matters for how we approach the settlement. Do you want this handled quietly, or are you comfortable with it becoming visible within his professional circle? I thought of Rosa's shaking voice on the phone, of 19 years of quiet discretion finally breaking, because staying silent had become impossible to justify. I think I'm done managing anyone's comfort but my own, I told her, and she nodded and made a note I didn't ask her to explain. Good, she said simply. That tends to make these cases move faster, in my experience. People who are still trying to protect the other person's reputation usually end up protecting far less of their own than they realize. I filed for divorce 3 weeks later. The firm Michael had spent 19 years building, it turned out, had a standing policy against romantic relationships between partners and outside consultants, a policy Michael himself had personally implemented 5 years earlier after an unrelated incident with a different employee. Back when he'd stood in our kitchen explaining, with real conviction, why the policy mattered for protecting the firm's culture. Sabrina's own formal resignation letter, submitted to HR within days of the dinner, and later shared, deliberately or not, with two of the firm's partners, cited an inappropriate relationship with a partner that I no longer wished to be associated with going forward. Language specific enough that the policy violation became impossible for anyone at the firm to interpret as rumor rather than documented fact. When two of his junior partners learned the details, they moved, within the quarter, to restructure his equity stake, citing conduct that created legal and reputational risk for the practice. One of them, a woman named Priyanka, who'd worked under Michael for nearly a decade, didn't simply support the restructuring quietly from the sidelines. She stood up at the partners' meeting herself and formally called the vote, telling the room plainly that she'd defended the policy to skeptical junior staff for years on the strength of Michael's own stated conviction, and that, watching him quietly violate it while continuing to enforce it against everyone else, had cost him more of her respect than almost anything else in a decade of working together. The vote to restructure passed unanimously, including, notably, Michael's own reluctant abstention rather than opposition. The firm's largest client at the time, a municipal redevelopment board, Michael had personally courted for over 2 years, didn't simply request a change in project lead. They terminated the contract entirely within the month, their board chair citing, in a formal letter later shared internally, concerns about leadership stability and professional judgment that went beyond what a reassigned project manager could adequately address. Within a year, the remaining partners voted to formally rename the practice, dropping Ashford entirely from both the letterhead and the building's signage. A change Michael, by then holding only a minority stake, had no meaningful ability to block. He kept a small office in the building for another 8 months before quietly relocating to a smaller practice across the city, one considerably less prestigious than the firm bearing his name had once been. Sabrina resigned from the firm within the same week, taking a position at a competing practice across town, and, according to a colleague who mentioned it to Rosa, rarely spoke about the circumstances of her departure to anyone. I heard, much later, secondhand, that she'd told a mutual friend she felt Michael had promised her far more certainty about his marriage status than had actually been true. A detail that, once again, brought me no real satisfaction to learn, only a tired, familiar recognition of a pattern I suspected wasn't new to him. The divorce settlement, once finalized, split our marital assets according to 19 years of genuinely combined effort. My own career had never fully paused the way some of the women in stories like this one describe. But the house Michael had designed, the one we'd built our whole life around, went on the market within the year, neither of us able to imagine living in it the way it had been designed to be lived in. Michael's reduced equity stake in the firm, combined with the settlement, meant he walked away from 19 years of marriage with considerably less than he'd likely expected. The week he sat down to plan that anniversary dinner, the finalization hearing itself lasted less than 20 minutes, briefer than I'd braced myself for. After months of paperwork and negotiation, both of us sitting at separate tables with our respective attorneys, while a judge, who had clearly presided over hundreds of similar mornings, read through the settlement terms. In a flat, efficient voice, Michael didn't look at me during the reading. I found myself oddly, not particularly needing him to. Rosa still works for me, in the smaller house I bought that following spring, a cozy place 2 streets from where Elise grew up, close enough that campus visits home still feel like coming back to something familiar. I've told Rosa more than once that 19 years of loyalty is not something I take lightly, especially not the kind that finally broke its own silence at exactly the moment it mattered most. She told me, the week after the divorce was finalized, that she'd almost not made that phone call, worried it wasn't her place, worried I'd be angry at her for interfering. "I'm very glad you did," I told her, and meant it more than almost anything I'd said in months. We celebrate her work anniversary now, every spring, something neither of us had ever formally done in the 19 years before that Tuesday, and last year, over cake at my kitchen table, she told me she'd finally stopped replaying that phone call in her head, wondering whether she'd done the right thing. "I know I did now," she said. "I didn't back then. I just knew I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try." My own career, which had never fully paused the way Michael's had absorbed so much of our household's identity, actually grew in the years that followed, in ways I hadn't expected. I made partner at my agency the following year, a promotion that had been quietly in discussion for months before the divorce, but that I'd somehow never found the bandwidth to properly pursue while managing the emotional weight of a marriage I now understood had been quietly ending for far longer than one anniversary dinner. My mentor at the firm, a woman who'd watched me juggle client accounts and a crumbling marriage without ever quite realizing the second thing was happening, told me over lunch shortly after the promotion that she'd noticed a change in me that year, something steadier, more decisive, that she hadn't seen in years. "You used to run every decision past Michael first, even small ones," she said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "This year you just started deciding things." I didn't know what had changed, but whatever it was, I liked watching it happen. I didn't tell her the full story behind it, but I recognized what she meant and found myself, for the first time in a long while, genuinely proud of the woman she was describing. Elise, home for winter break that first year, helped me pick out furniture. For the new house, both of us laughing, for the first time in months, over how bad we both were at assembling a bookshelf without the instructions. We spent an entire Saturday painting the small guest room a soft yellow she picked out herself, insisting it needed to feel cheerful for whenever she came home to stay, and something about watching her roll paint onto that wall, sleeves pushed up, humming along to music from her phone, felt like the first genuinely peaceful afternoon I'd had in nearly a year. I hosted my first anniversary of my own in that house the following autumn. Not a wedding anniversary, but the 1-year mark of the night everything changed. An occasion I hadn't planned to mark at all until Rosa quietly suggested it, telling me some dates deserve to be reclaimed rather than simply endured in silence every year they come back around. We had a small dinner, just the three of us, Rosa, Elise, and me, nothing elaborate, no good china, just a meal I cooked myself, and a bottle of wine we split 3 ways, and I remember raising my glass that evening to something entirely different than what I'd once imagined toasting on that date. Not to a marriage, to the two people who had shown up for me exactly when it mattered most. And to the strange, steady life I was learning to build, without needing anyone else's permission to make it good. I ran into Michael once, nearly 8 months after the divorce was finalized, at a hardware store neither of us had any particular reason to be in on a Saturday morning. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen on him before, older somehow, the particular tiredness of a man still working out how a life he'd assumed was permanent had come apart in under an hour. He was standing in the paint aisle, of all places, holding two nearly identical swatches, and for a strange moment I remembered doing something almost exactly like that myself, years earlier, choosing colors for a nursery that would eventually become Elise's room. "The house sold," he said by way of greeting, as though we were still the kind of people who shared that information easily. "I heard," I said. There was a beat where 19 years seemed to hover somewhere between us, unfinished and unfinishable. "I think about that night a lot," he finally said. "I keep trying to understand how I convinced myself it would just quietly work out." "I don't think you convinced yourself of anything, Michael," I said, not unkindly. "I think you just stopped believing you'd ever have to actually explain it to me." He didn't have an answer for that, setting the paint swatches back on the display rack without choosing either one, and after a moment we each went back to our separate errands, and that, as far as I know, was the last real conversation we've had. I think about that taxi ride often, 3 minutes from a house that no longer felt like mine the second I walked through its door. I don't think Rosa's warning saved my marriage. I think it saved me 19 minutes of finding out the truth some slower, crueler way, and let me walk into that dining room, already steady enough to sit down calmly, instead of falling apart in front of the two people least entitled to see it, I think too. About the silver sedan I saw in that office parking lot 4 months earlier, the one I drove past without stopping to ask a single question. I've made a kind of peace with that silence, the same way I've made peace with every quiet accommodation I made in the months before Rosa's phone's call. I wasn't foolish for not stopping that night. I was a woman who had spent 19 years believing that a good marriage meant trusting first and asking questions only when something forced the issue. It took a housekeeper's trembling voice on the phone to teach me that sometimes the asking has to come first, long before anyone hands you a reason you can no longer ignore. Some evenings, sitting in the new house with Rosa's coffee cooling beside me the way it always used to. On the mornings she came before Elise's school bus arrived, I think about how strange it is that the person who protected me most fiercely that year wasn't bound to me by anything but 19 years of quiet, unpaid attention to a family that wasn't technically hers to protect. I've stopped trying to figure out exactly why she chose that night to finally speak up after so many years of careful silence. I've settled instead for being endlessly grateful that she did. If you've ever had someone who had every reason to stay quiet, choose, instead, to tell you a hard truth, I hope you remember this. Loyalty that only shows up when it's easy was never really loyalty at all. The kind that matters is the kind that risks something to protect you, exactly when it would be simpler to look away. I think about how easily that phone call could have gone differently. Rosa deciding one more time that it wasn't her place, that 19 years of careful professional distance was worth more than the risk of speaking up. I'm endlessly grateful she chose otherwise, and I try, now, to be the kind of person who notices when someone else might need exactly that same courage extended to them. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Has anyone ever broken their silence to protect you at exactly the right moment? Leave a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from tonight. We share stories like this one every day, stories about quiet loyalty, hard truths, and the moment someone finally decides silence isn't an option anymore. If you'd like to be part of that journey, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember that the people who love you, honestly, are sometimes the ones brave enough to ruin your evening to save your life.